listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Snowies Camping Show, the place where Lauren and I just ramble on about all things camping, hiking, and enjoying the outdoors. If this is the first time you've joined us, don't forget to subscribe via our YouTube channel or your favourite podcast app. And you can join in on the conversation at our Snowies Camping Show Facebook group, where we'll do our best to jump in and answer questions or just be part of the conversation. Today, we're talking about a more technical topic, something I like, but it's Waterhead ratings. And we've brought someone in who knows more than us.
Well, technically we haven't brought them in, have we?
Not really. They're probably on a little screen somewhere around here at the moment. But we've got on the screen here Ryan Faulkner from Zempire Camping Equipment. How are you, Ryan?
Hey, doing great, guys. Good to be talking to you today.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. Hey, tell us a bit about yourself, just so the listeners know who you are and that you're not just some random that we've brought in from the street to, read a book and give us your opinion. So what's your background in the outdoor industry?
Yeah, awesome. So right now I'm working for Zempire. I'm a product specialist here. So I'm involved in pretty much everything to do with our products. So from the product development and design all the way through to training our retailers and things like that. So, and a big part of my role is managing our specifications and things like that. So we got correct product information. But my background, through university, I worked for other outdoor brands like Kathmandu and MacPack, and I've always been a big lover of the outdoors. I'm a hiker and fisherman myself. So yeah, big passion. So I kind of learned about these things as a consumer, but it's great to kind of see behind the curtain and working in the industry these days.
And training for an Ironman, apparently.
That's the current project. Yep.
What about the Zempire brand itself? Just, I think Zempire to me was new to me probably, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. You got a really good range of stuff, but just a little bit of background on the Zempire brand, because I think it originated in the UK or something. Is it there under a different label or something?
Also, where exactly you are, Ryan, and why you're not with us?
Yeah, good one.
In person.
Yeah, so we're actually based in Hamilton, New Zealand. So started here in New Zealand.
Okay.
We do sell in the UK as well, so I can understand that. But it was originally started under the brand Freedom Camping.
Yes, that's what I was thinking
when we expanded internationally, just trademarking purposes, we changed our brand to Zempire. So yeah, we're a relatively new brand. We've been around, 2006? Since 2006 when we started. And yeah, the main goal of Zempire is to create the best camping products out there. And we're kind of really well known for our inflatable tents because we're kind of some of the first to offer that in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, so definitely a pioneering brand. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's our goal. Look for the best technologies available, and that's kind of our design ethos.
Yeah, cool. So we want to talk today about Waterhead ratings, and we asked you guys about it because, Zempire covers a huge range of products, right? From all the camp accessories, camp furniture, and all the basic stoves, all of that, yeah, right through to tents. And you do have a really cool range of air tents, which we want to talk to you more about in a future episode, hopefully. But Waterhead ratings is something that our customers, it's a kind of a confusing thing because there's numbers out there that are Waterhead ratings that kind of say this is more waterproof than others, but it's not always that simple because there are other factors to think about that high number. It's not just, you've got the highest number, therefore you've got the best protection. It's not always the case. Sometimes it affects longevity. So we want to bring you in on that conversation. So should we start with a really high-level question on just to help people understand, like, what is a Waterhead rating? Could you simplify that?
Absolutely. So those Waterhead ratings, most brands offer them. It's basically a standardized measurement of how waterproof a fabric is. So it's not a rating for the tent design. It's specifically the fabric itself. And that's important to understand. There's more. It's just one component in the overall design, but it is a good way to kind of compare different fabrics and materials. Yeah, so that's the basic. It's just rating of the waterproofness, water resistance of the fabric.
Okay, and there is a testing method, isn't there? It's a couple of different methods they've got for testing Waterhead rating. Do you guys have a specific one you use, or is it a factory based thing?
Yeah, so basically Waterhead rating is measured in millimeters, and that actually comes from the original testing procedure. So the way that it's originally was tested was fabrics were placed into a jig, and there was a big column of water. So it's a clear tube that was basically clamped onto the fabric sample, and they'd fill up that tube, and however high the water got in that water column became the Waterhead rating. And that's why it's measured in millimeters. So if you see something that's rated 3,000 millimeters of hydrostatic head, it's because it can actually support 3,000 millimeters of a water column before leaking. Okay. These days, most brands don't use that kind of traditional tube method. They've been able to kind of convert the water pressures of those millimeters and use kind of a pressurized jig that's similar. It's called a Suter test, and that's what we use. So it's kind of starts before the tent's even made, testing the fabric samples themselves. And yeah, so it's placed in a jig and pumped up to pressure. And that's all based on that original water column test.
Cool. Have you got a...
That makes sense.
No, yeah. It does. Yeah, that was my understanding of it. I reckon probably the confusion, and correct me if you've got a different opinion here, Lauren, but I think the confusion from our customers or the unknown from a customer's point of view is we've got a 3,000 millimeter Waterhead, which relates to a tube on the fabric. But when I'm camping, I don't have tubes of water on my fabric. I've got rain hitting the tent. So is there kind of a, like say an average downpour, not a torrential rain, but just family camping tent and it rains, what sort of, do you know what sort of water pressure, because that driving rain, like you could pour 10 litres of water on a tent gently and it's not putting that much pressure on it, right? But one small droplet being wind driven into a piece of fabric is going to hit it at much more force. So that's where the higher Waterhead is required, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So basically this is a measure of water pressure. And like you said, if you have a tent fly that's pitched really well and it's nice and evenly tensioned, the water should just run off it. So for something like a tent fly under relatively calm conditions, you don't need a very high Waterhead rating to be able to perform well. But the minute that you start adding extra mechanical loads like physical pressure or water pooling, or like you said, wind-driven rain, it just is putting more and more pressure on the tent fly. So that's when you're going to need a higher spec fabric to be able to keep you dry. And probably a good example is something like an umbrella. Umbrellas aren't very waterproof, but there's not very much mechanical load being put on them, so they can still keep you dry.
Okay.
And I'm assuming there's no standardization with Waterhead testing and things like that. So it's ultimately up to the individual brand which methodology they go with.
Yeah, that's true. So it's not a government regulated type of testing. There are some independent companies that offer these standardized testings, and one of the kind of world leaders is a company called SGS. So we use an SGS approved facility that does most of our testing. But you are right. Some brands will kind of have different kind of standards and how they approach that. So that's something to keep in mind from the consumer point of view, is that, you know, it is a good comparison point, but only to a certain point. But when you're looking at different products from one brand in particular, it can be a really good comparison point for different fabrics and the different product lines.
Is there a specific Waterhead rating in millimeters that I'll reword that. My understanding was that I think 1,000 millimeter Waterhead rating is the point at which a fabric can be classed as waterproof. Am I right in that, or is this some myth that I've picked up somewhere along the way that isn't true?
Generally speaking, about 1,500 millimeters is considered waterproof. And it can seem like a little bit of an arbitrary number. There's an ISO standard. And again, it's not like a mandated required standard, but there is an ISO standard on camping tents. And they class kind of that minimum Waterhead rating being 1,500 millimeters. Whereas a higher spec tent designed for more harsh conditions, the minimum that you'd want to be looking at is about 3,000 millimeters for a tent fly, and then around 5,000 for a tent floor. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Anything over 1,000 or 1,500 can be considered waterproof.
Okay. I think you've raised a really good point with the tent floor there too, that a lot of people will look at it and think, I need the fly to be waterproof. And then they look into the details and go, why is the floor more waterproof? It's not even in the rain. But the the reason for that is that you've got 60 or 80 kilo person standing on that floor. And if that fabric is on top of wet ground, you're putting more force on that fabric into the wet ground than the rain is putting on the fly. So a higher waterhead floor is potentially more important than the fly for most average conditions.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
I have a question that's a bit off like our sheet here, but some tents come with a fly cap, not a full fly. So in terms of the tents that come with a fly cap and not a full fly, when they have a waterhead rating, I'm assuming that still only is applying to the fly and not the tent inner itself. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that would be correct. If they only give one rating, it's probably going to be for just the fly. Anything that's going to be exposed to rain should be waterproof as well. But if it's not kind of specifically outlaid, I assume that most brands would be just rating the fly itself, which is taking the majority of the beating from a rainstorm, something like that.
Yeah, sure.
I think I want to get a bit more technical on coatings and stuff shortly, but before we do that, I think you touched on it before, but the waterhead rating kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of other factors such as the seam sealing of the fabric and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the seam sealing is the application of tape, I believe, under sort of pressure and heat to the seams of the fabric, because obviously when you sew it, you put a bunch of holes in it and it can leak through that. So that's a factory applied sealant though, isn't it, on those seams? So can you elaborate a bit more on that? Anything that we don't know about on how seam sealing works and its reliability?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a good thing to bring up, because really what the consumer wants to know is my tent going to keep me dry? You know, and the waterhead rating of the fabric is just one piece of that puzzle. And we find like we said, you know, a good quality fabric doesn't need to be that highly coated to keep you dry. So in most cases, it's going to be something like a seam that's leaking, and that's how water's getting in. So the overall construction of the tent becomes really critical, and the design becomes really important beyond just, you know, how waterproof is the fabric. So yeah, we tape the seams on our polyester tent flies, and you're right. It's a heat and pressure treated tape that goes along those stitching lines to completely seal it out, because, you know, obviously when you're stitching, you're putting a bunch of holes into the fabric itself where water can get in. So that's just an extra layer of protection so water doesn't get through the stitching lines. And usually it is in the form of tape. In some other cases, you can use something like a silicone seam sealer, and that's something that consumers can apply after the fact as well. But in the factory, the most reliable and neatest way to do it is with seam tape for sure. Okay.
And there's often a treatment on the outside, a DWI treatment, similar to rain jackets, right? And that's, I don't know if that adds to the waterhead, but my understanding is that it just, it's a bit like waxing your car, right? The water hits it and it just helps clear that water off of the fabric so that it stays dry and therefore performs better.
Yeah. So the construction, I suppose waterproof breathable jackets are a little bit different, but when it comes to a tent, you start with a piece of fabric, and then it's several layers of polyurethane, usually coating to one side of the tent fly. But the fabric that you've started with to begin isn't inherently waterproof completely. So you add that water repellent finish so that the outer fabric doesn't absorb water, which then puts more pressure on that polyurethane coating on the inside.
Cool.
So is the DWR treatment done before the waterhead rating test or after?
Yes, for sure. So
okay.
It all plays together in a part of a system. Mm-hmm. And that's something to keep in mind in terms of general maintenance of a tent. You know, the polyurethane coating, which does most of the heavy hitting in terms of keeping that fabric waterproof, is applied from the factory level. But that durable water repellent coating is something that, you know, different sprays and things can help to extend the life of your tent. Mm-hmm. And so that's something, you know, after a lot of use and exposure to UV light, that can help to extend the life of your tent by adding a water resistant spray finish a couple of years after you buy your tent.
What about maintaining that PU coating is usually on the underside of the fabric in most cases. What about maintaining that and the longevity of the seam sealant? Because you get condensation on the tent, right, and that dries. Should people be rinsing the inside of their fabrics to try and get longevity out of it? I mean, I don't know of anyone who actually, regularly rinses the inside and outside of their fly sheet.
I don't think I've ever actually washed a tent fly in my life, to be honest.
I did my tent fly on the weekend quickly because it had bird poo and stuff on the outside, but I've never washed the inside free because of condensation and stuff. I mean, if people want to go to that degree, does that benefit in the longevity of the fabric?
We don't usually find as many issues on the inside. It's not as exposed to things like bird droppings or tree sap and things like that. I think the key thing is making sure that you're packing your tent away dry. So that would be my major point of recommendation in terms of maintenance is never pack away your tent wet. Sometimes you need to because it's in the middle of a rainstorm, but make sure it gets dried out as soon as possible, because on the inside of the tent, mildew is probably the biggest issue in terms of that long-term performance of the tent fabric itself. So making sure to avoid that's the main thing, but also cleaning off any mildew. And if you do need to do that, we just recommend warm water and like a soft brush to start with, because any kind of harsh chemicals can really degrade that waterproof performance of the fly.
Okay.
In terms of also storing your fly, I know with some hiking tents and things like that, it's recommended that the fly is actually stuffed loosely into a mesh bag and not packed up, rolled tight with the tent, because if it is rolled up tight with the tent, sometimes it can contribute to delamination over time of that PU coating. Is there any considerations like that to be taken with the larger family tents as well? Or, would you have, in an ideal situation, is there a best way to store your fly in your tent from that perspective?
From the Zempire product range point of view, the majority of our flies are actually sewn into the ground sheet of the tent. So it's not so easy to actually separate the two. So our recommendation would be, as we said before, just make sure that it's dry when you pack it away.
Yeah.
Probably the main thing that's going to cause the issues is actually abrasion. So kind of a lot of rubbing kind of thing. So when you do pack it away, just make sure that, that it's relatively flat. There's nothing kind of sharp mixed in there kind of thing it's going to rub up against type of thing. We're not really too worried about storing the fly separately to the thing. As long as you've taken care and packed it away dry, it should be safe to leave it rolled up for storage.
In my experience, it's usually in really odd tents, it's that seam sealing that starts to break down first. It comes away from the seams there, but I think we mentioned it before that that's pretty easily overcome with seam sealing and stuff. So if people have got an old tent that's starting to break down in the seams, unless it's leaking all over the place, it's still probably perfectly usable, particularly if you've got a good quality tent. Just with an addition of a little bit of seam sealant, take some with you.
I think we've got a video coming up with that, like a bit of a how-to video with that as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, good way. Keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
Now, I want to get a little bit technical now because now the coatings we talked about before, so PU coatings go on the underside, right? And it's not just one big thick layer of PU coating. But the more coatings you have, the higher the Waterhead rating, right? And now I'm just quoting from my head here, from my understanding and my research. But if you add too many PU coatings, you also decrease the tear strength of the fabric. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And that's something to really keep in mind, is that process of coating the tent can weaken the fabric, and it can also make it a little bit stiffer and a little bit more brittle. So you can't take a really thin, lightweight piece of fabric and then just coat it with tons of thick layers of polyurethane, because that would actually result in a lower quality and a weaker product. So, to get a higher Waterhead rating, you need to start with a stronger and thicker fabric to begin with that can actually support that, or else it won't actually, it'll actually result in quite a weak and brittle fabric. So, and we really keep that in mind. Again, that the Waterhead rating is just one component of the overall tent design. So if we're designing our top of the range products that we're going to give a 5-year warranty to, it needs to start with a thick and durable fabric, and it needs to have enough PU coating that it's going to be able to withstand 5 years of use and exposure to UV light. Whereas, a lower end product that's not as expected to be used in as harsh of conditions or not as expected to be lasting as long will typically have the balance of a lighter weight fabric and less PU coating. But yeah, you definitely don't want to have a thin, lightweight fabric with a huge waterhead rating, because that can actually lead to problems.
So it's probably a good one for consumers. They're looking at maybe a cheaper temp, but it's got a higher waterhead rating, but that's not necessarily the case. If you're looking at a reputable brand with a lesser waterhead rating, all of those other factors that you mentioned there in terms of the fabric that you start with are all chosen for a reason, not just for that number, which is almost an easy kind of sales point, I suppose, for some people to go for. To think it's got a high waterhead rating, I'll be fine, but then their tent's tearing to pieces in high wind because of the low tear strength.
Yeah, of course. And when you compare Zempire tents to other tents, the significantly higher waterhead rating on Zempire tents compared to majority of the brands. I don't think I've sort of seen, or in average in Australia anyway, of the brands that we sell, you're looking at sort of 3,000 to 3,500 mil waterhead ratings. Your Zempire tents, I don't think I've seen any below 10,000 on a fly, possibly maybe in those family tents, or at least definitely on the floor as well. What is the sort of reasoning behind having such a high waterhead rating on your tents, and the considerations then obviously that you've taken with the fabrics and stuff as well?
That's a great question. And we do have quite a range. So our more inexpensive ranges of tents start out at the 3,000 to 5,000 millimeter hydrostatic head rating. But going up to our Pro series, which is our top of the range polyester tent range, we have a 10,000 millimeter hydrostatic head rating. And the reason for that, because we did mention earlier that you don't need a 10,000 millimeter fly to keep you dry. At least on day one when the tent is brand new, a lower spec rain fly is going to get the job done really well. But our reasoning for over-speccing those tent flies is because of the long-term performance and the long-term durability of those coatings. Because the more you use it, the more you set it up, pack it down, and expose it to UV light, those coatings and the fabric itself will degrade. So in a couple of years' time, a higher spec and thicker and stronger material is still going to be performing really well. Whereas a lower spec fabric will start to degrade, and it's not going to be waterproof after several years of use. So that's kind of our design strategy, is that thinking of the long term, starting with an overspec material. And
so with that high waterhead rating, I'm assuming also the breathability of the fabric can be affected. So does that mean that you then have to take in extra consideration with ventilations in your tents and things like that, because it does have that high waterhead rating?
That's a good question. And basically any coated fabric is not going to be breathable. Breathability, it would require, like in a jacket, to use a porous membrane, and that's kind of a totally different technology. But in a polyester tent fly, once you add those layers of polyurethane, it actually completely eliminates breathability. So even from a 1,500 millimeter hydrostatic head all the way up to 10,000, they're going to have similar breathability.
Okay.
So that's another important consideration in terms of keeping me dry, because not only do you have to worry about rain coming from the outside, but condensation is a huge problem in terms of moisture in the tent. So, and that again goes back to having not just a good quality fabric, but a well-designed tent that does have good ventilation and airflow to minimize condensation building up.
So we covered that in a previous episode. We did a whole thing on condensation. So for those listeners who are interested, jump on, I don't know what episode number it was, but that's usually one of the first questions we jump to when someone says my tent's leaking. It's, how are you sleeping? What are you sleeping in, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, because 90% of the time it would be condensation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we went into that, but that was a fun episode. So have a listen to that if you're interested. Now, I want to pull back on one thing you said earlier, and you mentioned 5 years, which stood out to me. Obviously, you do some sort of testing or some expectation you have around a certain amount of UV exposure or something. You expect it to last 5 years. Now, that's obviously a very arbitrary number, because if someone camps every day for 5 years, it's probably not going to go for 5 years. So you must have some sort of average that you kind of work to that. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah. So when we kind of offer warranties, so our Pro Series has a 4-year warranty, for example, which is quite a bit longer than the industry standard for a tent.
That's great.
That's assuming general camping use. So not that this is being used as a permanent living structure or anything like that. And we estimate that to be about 4 to 5 weeks of camping per year. So you could get 4 years of use if you used it for several months straight. But most recreational campers will use their tent 4 or 5 weeks a year at the most. So that's kind of from our warranty perspective where we arrive at those numbers.
Okay, that's interesting.
And that's another good point is that a lot of people use their tents far less than that. You know, if you only camp a couple of weeks a year, you might be able to get even more life out of your tent. But keeping in mind that, you know, polyester fabrics do degrade over time, mostly with use, but also just with time.
So having good maintenance practice, like we mentioned below, is essential too.
Yeah. I can't think of any other questions our consumers have. I think I've learned a bit out of this episode, but I would say probably, But
I have a question.
Sorry, I'm butting in.
So we talked a little bit about how floor and fly are different. Is the actual water testing done on floor fabric different to the water testing done on the fly? Because obviously it's not necessarily under pressure. It could just be sitting in a pool of water, literally.
Yeah, so if there's a hydrostatic head rating measured in millimeters, it's going to be the same testing. And so, for example, our adventure tents, our hiking tents, have polyurethane coated floors. So they have the same testing procedure. When you look at a floor material such as polyethylene or like PE tarp material, it's quite a different type of fabric. So rather than being a woven polyester that's coated with polyurethane, it's actually polyethylene that's been laminated. So for most purposes, it's completely sealed and waterproof. So we don't give a hydrostatic head rating for something like a PE floor like we would on a nylon or polyester tent floor. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense because I have noticed some tents don't even have a waterproof rating for the floor, and that explains why.
Same with PVC, I suppose, because that's I don't think it's even laminate. I don't know how PVC is made, but it's just non-porous at all. It's a completely waterproof material, also very heavy. Yeah.
Yeah, so often just considered waterproof and not rated in a hydrostatic head.
How would you consider, if you're a consumer and you're looking at purchasing a tent, how do Waterhead ratings sort of, in your opinion, guide your tent purchase in terms of if you're wanting to work out what you need for different seasons and things like that? Do you have a bit of an idea on that?
Yeah, and going back to the ISO standards, they kind of give that recommendation as to make it so it's not just picking a number out of a hat. And they rate it for a 4-season tent. It should be at least a 3,000 millimeter hydrostatic head for the fly and at least a 5,000 millimeter hydrostatic head for the tent floor. So that's kind of a good just baseline starting number. We don't actually give season ratings for our tents. So we don't really look at it like our 3-season tents get this rating and our 4-season tents get this rating. We kind of aspire to just making all of our tents at that minimum standard. Another point of view is just how are you going to be using the tent? If this is a tent that you're going to be leaving up in the sun all day long, like a family camping tent, you probably want a higher spec fabric. Whereas if you're going hiking and you're just setting it up in the evening, taking it down in the morning, it's not going to be as exposed to as much UV light, for example. So you can probably prioritize saving some weight over having a super high spec fly material. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's useful for consumers because it's got to be taken into consideration with the weight, as you say. If you put a 10,000 mil Waterhead rating on a hiking tent, it's probably going to weigh a lot more than the equivalent. You just can't have can't have your cake and eat it too, I
Yeah,
suppose.
that's true. And it's good information as well for people with selecting hiking tents, because a lot of people call up and they're like, what's the highest Waterhead rating you've got? But it doesn't necessarily mean, that you have to go with a 10,000 mil one or a 3,000 mil one if it's going to essentially be sort of the same thing.
Yeah. But your example of, say, 3,000 and 5,000 for a 4-season tent, for a family tent to be a 4-season tent with that rating is probably far more than the average family is going to be camping out in anyway. And if the weather's so bad, that
especially in Australia,
if the weather's that bad that you need to withstand those sort of, waterheads or that sort of pressure of rain coming in, then you're probably not enjoying your camping trip.
Most people won't be there. I'll be there, but
just pack
other
up and
people
go home.
probably won't. Yeah.
I reckon that's. Have you got any more questions before I butt in again?
I think I'm all right.
I think we're done.
Sorry.
That was really useful, Ryan. I hope that helps our listeners best understand or help them to decide or work out where Waterhead ratings fits into their purchase decision with their tents. So
Definitely.
is there anything else you wanted to add, Ryan? Any little secrets or gems, or have you got everything off your mind that is useful for customers that you've had in your experience?
Probably just as a closing note, hydrostack head ratings, they are really important and they are a useful kind of metric, but it's just important to keep in mind as that it's just one component of the overall tent design. And, us here at Zempire, we do aspire to offer the best product available and over-speccing those. So, things like weight and whatnot are not always the top priority in a family camping tent. So, making sure that product can still perform well down the line is something really to keep in mind beyond just, is it going to work well on day one?
Yeah, I think we've talked about that a bit before in other podcast episodes of like buy once, buy right. So it's a good point to make.
Costs less in the long run.
It does, absolutely.
If you want to join in on the conversation on Waterhead ratings, got any questions for Ryan, Lauren and I will do our best. If we can't answer it, we'll ask Ryan to answer it. But jump on our Facebook group, the Snowman's Camping Show Facebook group. I'm getting all muddled up. If you haven't joined yet, ask to join. We'll welcome you into the group. And as we mentioned at the start of the show, don't forget to subscribe via YouTube or your favourite podcast app. Thanks for joining us, Ryan. It's been great having you here. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
See you later, folks.
See you guys.